No, I can't hear you. Don't call me names. Is the light on the side of your headphones supposed to be red or green or blue? It's red, which usually means off. But I mean, I'm no headphone guy. I don't know. I can't read your lips when you're just mumbling. Although I don't know that I want to read them. Could be. It says connecting. Hey, you just lit up.
Yeah? Can you hear
Yeah, yeah.
me?
See,
I'm a genius. I'm a
congrats.
genius with the mind of a champion.
Congratulations. You figured out how to hook up your wireless Bluetooth headset to your computer. So it's, I don't know if that qualifies you as a genius. No offense, but I do feel like other people have managed to do this before. I don't feel like you're breaking new ground, but
Uh,
that's all right. I mean, I will give you this. My mom couldn't
yes.
do that. So you
Oh, okay,
congratulate.
good.
You're
Good,
doing
good,
better
good.
than my mom. Completely unbalanced.
Come on now, Brian.
That's pretty awful.
Oh my God.
He's unbalanced.
This guy is a lunatic.
These men lived in a much different time. God, we got some kooky people back in this time.
It's not obvious that we are professionals. You're not paying attention. We know what we're doing.
But I'm serious.
Can we start already?
Hmm?
Like I said, this is a little bit more of I think maybe a little ambitious. So we'll see what happens.
Okay.
A slightly more ambitious. It might be a little intellectually, bit more intellectually, uh, not challenging. Just it's a different kind of topic. So,
Sure, sure.
I do, feel free to stop me and ask questions, but don't you dare disagree with me.
What
Uh,
is this? What is the general what is the
uh,
general plot here? What are we
well,
talking
we're
about?
gonna get into it pretty quickly. So I
Okay,
mean, or
okay.
at least I'm going to give you the theoretical kind of framework that we're working under pretty quickly. So, with that in mind, hello and welcome, unbalanced listeners. This is Unbalanced Views of History, a mostly American history podcast. I'm Brian, a history nerd and erstwhile scholar. In each unbalanced episode, I read a fascinating and usually little known story from history to my friend, a decorated veteran of the culture wars, a man so dedicated to the cause, he bought 10 gas stoves just to own the libs. He denounced the woke Pink Floyd or denounced woke Pink Floyd for putting a rainbow on their 50th anniversary Dark Side of the Moon re-release and is currently mad that Xbox now has a lower energy setting. It's Mike. Mike, how's it
That
going,
was a
buddy?
that was awesome and you nailed it. That was everything I've been doing over the last couple of weeks. So it's good, man. It's good. Everything's going great. Everything's going great. And I'm just cooking on all burners right now. What are you up
Sure.
to?
It's good. Yeah, all the gas burners. I got a slight headache. I'm a little lightheaded. I'm sure it's fine.
Don't light your cigarette right now, okay?
I have to say the Xbox thing has thrown me a little bit. The
I didn't know that about the Xbox.
Yeah, it's brand new. I saw your boy Ted Cruz tweeting about it that now they're coming for your Xbox. First it was your gas stove, and then it was I don't know something else that's made up, and now it's your Xbox. Xbox basically just like they just announced that they have this long-term plan to be carbon neutral by 2040 or something like that.
Hmm.
And as part of that plan, when I say Xbox, I mean Microsoft. As part of that plan, they've created a new setting that you can choose to use on your Xbox. You can also choose not to use it, but it's
Hmm.
a lower energy setting that they have been really upfront. They're like, well, it will slow your boot up times very slightly,
Hmm.
but it uses less power, and so that's the whole thing. It'll use less power, and it I think instead of going into like sleep mode, I guess it goes into whatever the next level down is, so that it
Off.
well, no. There's like a sleep mode, and then there's like a hibernate. So I think instead of sleep mode, it goes into like hibernate, which is
Uh-huh.
a lower power setting. Sleep mode, when you wake it up from sleep mode, it immediately boots up. Hibernate takes a minute to get running back up and running. So whatever, that's like a thing that they've put in, just saying like, okay, this is here's a thing that everybody can do if they want to. Nobody's being like forced against their will to do this, but everybody's all at it. I don't know. Ted Cruz and some other weird, like right wing weirdos are trying to turn it into some sort of cultural war issue because, like, I don't know, because what else do they have? Anyway, it's throwing me a little bit. It's just beyond weird, but that's okay. Like,
I mean,
whatever, man.
I honestly didn't hear about it until you brought it up. I don't know
Mhm.
why anyone would give a shit about that.
Because they take a lot of money from oil and gas, and I guess they're concerned about anything that reduces energy usage. So, but that's not. They're not going to say that. They're going to say it's freedom.
Huh.
But of course, you have the freedom. You can choose not to do the thing. So, whatever,
Yeah,
man. It's just weirdo stuff. As I've said to you many, 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 many times, because there are no there are no politics to improve the material lives of people anymore. Like, that ship has sailed. Like, our political system is so completely captured by corporate interests that, like, there is no more mass politics. It's over. And so they don't have anything left except for culture war stuff. So that's like the best they can do is like, hey, we're not going to make your life better, but we can like direct you towards people to be mad at. And hey, look at her. She has blue hair. I'll bet she voted for Hillary Clinton. Let's make that an issue. I mean, it's like just this sort of shallow whatever. I mean, whatever. It's in the absence of any actual real politics, what else do you have? It's like, well,
yep.
let's see if we let's see if we can keep zapping some electricity into this dead horse and get it running just a few more feet, kick it down the road before the whole thing crumbles. Let's see what happens. Anyway,
I find that to be absolutely silly.
We have not even gotten to sunshine yet, Mike. For God's sakes, we gotta move on. So, back to the topic, or back to the intro to the intro.
Intro to the intro.
Intro to the intro. So tonight, we are going to dig into a topic that is near and dear to your heart.
Oh,
we're gonna talk about some Western capitalist themes, and we're gonna dig into some what I think is some pretty heady stuff. And so, like I said before, I really want you to chime in and stop me so we can sort of tackle any challenging ideas or themes along the way. Okay.
Yeah.
So now, dear listeners, please don't run screaming into the hills just yet. It will not be boring or too academic, or at least I hope it won't. We're going to be framing our story around the American South, mostly the antebellum South. Mainly, we're going to focus on the time from 1830 to like 1860. But most importantly, what I hope is that much of what we discuss here will resonate with you, Mike, and with you, our unbalanced listeners, with our present historical moment. Like, I think a lot of what we're going to talk about today is stuff that feels familiar to some of the discussions that we're having in our present moment. So, there's an expression among historians that goes, history doesn't really repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And I think this episode reflects that. But before we get started,
okay,
Mike,
yes.
Mike,
yes,
Mike,
yes. Yep.
What's your sunshine this week, buddy?
Ooh, my sunshine for the week. That's a good one. My sunshine for the week. Well, I have potentially found a new home, which is exciting.
That is exciting.
In the process of moving.
Okay.
I have also found potentially some new clients on the horizon, so that's exciting as well. I'm so far so good, healthy this year, and so yeah, no complaints. The sun is shining in my world. How about yourself?
Well, mine's a little silly, and I don't care. I found these. I got these. This is really silly because I don't want to sound like a Disney adult, but it just happens to be the case that.
Yeah, I know many of them.
My wife got me these sweatpants for Christmas, and they're I don't know. They're Disney. They're like Disney. I don't know. Whatever. They're like a retro Disney sweatpants, and I know this is dumb, but my God, they're just like
they're
just the most comfortable sweatpants I've owned, and where Disney has these two little stores down in Orlando where they sell stuff on clearance. And because of having a 7-year-old and having a 5-year-old niece and, and a 1.5-year-old nephew and all that stuff, I do like to stop in there periodically because they, for everybody. And, but while I was there, I never really, I don't usually get anything for myself or even really look much for myself, but like I saw these sweatpants. I was like, oh, I kind of like those. I like the way they feel. And Carla got them for me for Christmas. So anyway,
Nice.
I know it's dumb, but I can't, I don't, I really don't buy, things like loungy clothes for myself. I have a pair of Raven sweatpants that I've been wearing for like a decade now that, have so many like just baked in, probably like little butter and oil spots from cooking in them, and they're really faded purple and all that, and they're great, but like they could be upgraded. And anyway, I was pretty excited because I threw away. I was like the two pairs of sweatpants. I like to keep a rotation of 3.
I do too. You're right. I have 3.
3. That's all. That's what I want. And so I'd gotten rid of some, so I was down to 2. Anyway, so I'm just excited that I have replaced my second pair, and they turned out to be a real good pick, because if they hadn't been, I would still probably wear them for the next like 7 years before I replaced them. So I'm glad that they're awesome. So
I love it.
I know it's a dumb sunshine. I've got some other stuff going on, but I don't want to jinx anything, so I'm not going to say anything.
Yeah. Good.
Yeah. So I'm going to stick with that until the next episode. Okay. So with that out of the way, today, you got to stop walking around. You're making me nervous.
Why?
You're pacing around like you're in a boiler room. I'm waiting for you to try and sell me a plot at Glengarry Glen Ross. Anyway,
I stay active. I stay up. I stay refreshed like that. Walk around. Well, shoot a rack.
It's very distracting. So anyway, so today, Mike, what we're going to talk about are competing visions of independence. Okay?
Competing visions of independence.
Right. Because independence doesn't really mean anything. It means lots of different things to lots of different people. And in short, our whole the entire history of the United States, but a lot of countries or places or people can be sort of described as battles over different visions of independence. And so we're going to look at the ways that labor is organized and managed. And most important, we're going to talk about time.
Oof, the most valuable commodity on the face of the planet. Love it. Let's do it, baby.
Well, then
right up my alley. This is what I talk to my clients about. Time. How do we give you back your time?
You're going to love this, because that's everything we're talking about today is how that idea seeped into our country.
And now it's all about automation, baby.
Yeah.
That's the ultimate time saver, and it's going to be the ultimate economy cruncher.
Yeah, it's going to destroy the economy. It's going to destroy people is what it's going to do. Anyway.
It's going to destroy a lot of things.
Yeah. Now listen, I want you to keep keep this idea in your mind. This recently deceased historian, Michelle Sobel, she argued, quote, "A culture's sense of time is key to its nature," end quote.
Yes.
Because
correct.
There are different visions of time that people hold. You're looking at a bunch of different groups of people, the way they view different kinds of time. There's an East African saying that time slows down for everyone, even time, which I kind of like. Or in Trinidad, where they say it's always Trinidad time, or rather, any time is Trinidad time. And again, just a different idea. Like we're about time. There are some groups of people, for example. Some groups that don't have a single word for time, whereas time is a noun in English. There are other people who have like different words to describe different types of time and whatnot. So this is what we're going to kind of think about, is how culture's sense of time is key to that culture's nature. And whether or not that's true or not, I'm not sure. We're going to talk about it, but like that, I like that idea. And we're going to hold on to that for this whole episode. And we're going to try and get a sense of the nature of the antebellum and New South, by trying to understand the competing senses of time there, and how those senses of time change over time. And by extension, maybe we can understand a little something about our own nature today. All right. Are you ready?
I'm ready. Let's roll. I'm here. Can't you not hear me?
No, I couldn't hear you. I heard you.
Can you not hear me?
Yeah, I hear you. Okay. Are you there? Yeah.
You hear me now?
I hear you now.
What's wrong with this thing?
You in the bathroom?
Yeah.
Oh.
I've got full bars too. Okay, good.
Yeah. Maybe it was just giving me a courtesy silence because you're in the bathroom.
No.
Okay. All right. Let's do some history. Sociologists, historians, and just humanities scholars in general refer to the 300-year period. Huh? Are you breaking up already? Killing me, Smalls. It's a very professional podcast we've got going here. Very professional. It's like a finely tuned machine, like a tightly wound clock, maybe. All right. Are you there?
I don't know what's going on with my connection here. It was going really in and out, but I have full bars here. Interesting.
It's bad in the bathroom.
My office. I can't go to my office.
I think it's just sparing me the bathroom.
All right.
All right. So sociologists, historians, and humanities scholars in general refer to the 300-year period from 1650 to 1950, give or take, as the period of modernity, as in like the modern era. And so, I mean, again, I just want to point that out because we use the word modern all the time to talk about stuff today, but I want to use it in a very specific kind of a specific way.
Right.
So we today live in a postmodern world, according to most scholars. And but briefly, modernity is defined as a kind of period. Again, it's one of those things where it's like, well, how do you know if a country is modern? Well, I don't know. There are a number of different things that we can point to and say, well, these seem to be these seem to be the characteristics of a modern country or a country that is becoming modern or whatever. And so some percentage of those things, or some variation of those things is how we identify a place as modern.
The Industrial Revolution.
Yeah, but not necessarily. There are ways to be modern without industrialization. So, and we're going to talk about that a bit today because we're looking at the South. So modernity is defined as a period that has is characterized by nation state building, urbanization, capitalism, industrialization, right, to some degree, and a belief in progress through science. That, this idea that science is going to sort of solve our problems, which, we still sort of have some of that. Generally speaking, this era ends kind of in the aftermath of World War II, because World War II leads to a collapse in the belief that humanity is somehow progressing as a species, right? Like the whole idea that like generation after generation after generation was improving on the one before kind of falls apart with like, dropping the atomic bombs and like the instant vaporization of, like 60,000 people in one go. People are like, this doesn't seem like we're improving as a species, right? So postmodernism. World War II really makes people sort of question everything. World War I did too, but it becomes much more prevalent after World War II. So postmodernism is sort of defined by globalism, consumerism, kind of cultural diversity, and what's called hyper reality, where the mass media, the social media, things like that are able to present things to us, media images and whatnot that are literally realistic, hyper real, not just real, not realistic like a 70s TV show was, because people then thought what they were watching was very realistic. It looks like, you can identify.
Okay.
Again, movies do the same thing.
Yes.
Anyway. Okay. So, but also there's postmodernism is sort of defined by a kind of skepticism about inherited institutions and knowledge, especially science, politics, and even, as we've seen in the last few years, there are even debates about what is true. There are literally skepticism about truth or whether truth even exists. So some people argue that social media and mobile communication has sent us into a kind of postmodernism, but obviously that's a discussion for people better trained than us. There's like an argument that social media and particularly, sort of the accessibility of instantaneous communication at all times has sent us into something that even goes to a new sort of epic of human existence.
Yes.
Anyway, that's another thing. Anyway, it's important to remember that these terms are kind of attempting to describe processes, that is, contested shifts that occur in human societies that appear clearer to us from our vantage point here in the future. But that, of course, leads to the false kind of sense that these things were inevitable. And it also tends to lead us to not necessarily pay attention to the processes at the moment. Like we're not able to see the changes that are occurring at our present moment. Somebody in the future will look back and be like, oh, it was so obvious what was happening over these 20 years or 50 years or whatever, right? That makes sense?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Okay. So as with all of what I would call the detritus of history, is the flotsam and jetsam of history, we can learn much from examining the contested terrain itself instead of just like how it concluded, right? Like if we actually look at the way these things sort of were battled over, changes were battled over. As we're going to look at capitalist formation, I think it's useful to think about something Karl Marx observed on this topic. Marx emphasized the revolutionary nature of capitalism. It, according to him, it annihilated the old social organizations and ushered in, quote, the uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, end quote. Or what today Silicon Valley bros kind of celebrate as disruptive technologies, right? So, that was Karl Marx's take, primarily looking at capitalism as the replacement for feudalism. That it annihilated all social relationships that had existed in the way they existed. And so a whole new infrastructure, like a social capital, political economy, all of that stuff had to be rebuilt from, not really from the ground up exactly, but kind of from the ground up piecemeal in order to put things back together, because the contradictions of the old system just became too bloated and desiccated and kind of fell apart. And so everything had to be rebuilt new. It's part of why we have all those like crazy wars of religion in the sort of aftermath of feudalism's demise, right? The system can no longer hold itself together. And so you just have all of the frustrations and everything else get vented out as, those papists, they have to die. And the Catholic Church kind of figuring out ways to rewrite the Bible to say, well, actually, assassinating political leaders who have gone Protestant is totally fine in the Bible. The Bible says
totally
that,
fine.
And so we're just going to put another footnote down there to we can do that. Anyway, one of the most disruptive and tyrannical, and that's important, tyrannical, it is a tyrant, technologies that emerged in the modern era, one that created a whole new language and completely reoriented and reordered society. And it's one whose meaning kind of remains fraught and fought over in many cultures today. I am talking about the most obscure, most abstract of the intangibles of our human existence. And it's one we hardly ever think about, although you obviously do. It's time. Right?
Told you.
It is completely intangible.
Through the hourglass. Sand through the hourglass, my friend. It goes way too fast.
We often hear or even say time is money.
And it's fleeting.
That too. But this understanding, the association of intangible time, right? Something that doesn't exist that we sort of make up and imagine, right? We have to create the idea of time. And it's the association of this intangible thing with the most tangible, the most objective quality that we have as people, money, right? Something that is entirely an object, or at least it was. Now it's hard to know exactly what it is. But up until now, money has always been literally objective. It's always been a physical thing that you could hold, that you can touch. It is completely objective. It is an object that you exchange for another object. It's an object that by itself serves no value whatsoever, only as a unit of exchange, right? Like, so it is a purely objective item. Does that make sense? Do you understand what this is where it's like the philosophy is a little, where it's like, but like if you wanted to build a house, having a stack of $100 bills does you no good. Only if you can hand them to somebody else for lumber, for stone, for concrete for whatever.
Services too. Yes.
Right. So it is it is kind of unique in that way. We don't really have anything else that exists in our experience that is kind of that same thing. Something that is completely worthless by itself, but that we imbue with value and meaning collectively.
Because it's backed up by the credit of the United States.
No, I mean, whether it's a dollar, whether it's a pound sterling, whether it's a piece of gold, whether it's a diamond, whatever it is, like whatever we're using thing. as an exchange. Yeah. Okay, so it's very tangible and it's completely objective. Okay. Mm-hmm. But again, this is not this association of intangible time with tangible money doesn't just naturally occur. It has to be constructed. The association has to be forged, thought over. And again, this is a seemingly universal idea that time is money and that moments spent in non-productive time is wasted time, or that we can lose time, save time, or make up time. They're all rooted in the idea that time and money are linked. Again, a thing we had to create. Excuse me. We have hourly wages. We have Super Bowl ads that are charged by the second. We have lawyers who charge by the minute, right? And we accept all of these as if they're just sort of natural processes, but they aren't, right? There are lots of famous warnings about all of these associations. I mean, nobody listened, but like there were these warnings, or they didn't care. But like, I think it's worth, again, we're thinking about the contest over these ideas. So one of the most obvious examples to me about that is as a warning about these things is the White Rabbit in Lewis Carroll's 1865 classic Alice in Wonderland. Mm-hmm. The harried, frenetic bureaucrat White Rabbit, who has been ground down, crushed even by the pressures of time, whose life is literally dictated by clock time, and who stands, remember, like he's like, if he doesn't adhere to whatever the clock time says, he will literally lose his head, right? And he's just, he's a ground down, stuttering mess because he's been crushed by the weight of time. And he stands in perfect contrast to Alice with her youthful exuberance, right? Reflected in more kind of event time orientation as opposed to this clock time orientation. Like she flutters from event to event when she spontaneously determines that it is time to move along, as opposed to the White Rabbit whose entire life is dictated by this mechanical time device, right? So again, there's the difference between clock time and sort of event or task time, right? Mm-hmm. Anyway, so she, that's when she decides to move along. Edgar Allan Poe wrote frequently to raise the alarm about the tyranny of the clock. So take, for example, he has a story in 1838 called A Predicament, in which the main character, Signora Psyche Zenobia, whose behavior is described in the whole short story in these mechanistic terms. She is following the dictates of Blackstone, and she can only follow exactly what Blackstone has. Blackstone is a magazine. Well, only what Blackstone has published as rules for life. So she's very mechanistic. She has to follow these rules exactly, right? Follow the mechanics as they're laid out. Okay, so that's how she's described, and she in the story she goes up to the top of this hill, the top of the city, and she finds this. She sees this huge clock way at the very top, and there's a keyhole, as there used to be. You used to have to put a key in to wind, so there's a keyhole in the face of the clock, and she puts her head through in order to look out, to sort of look out on the other side of the clock, this huge clock face. And when she does, she gazes upon this sublime vision. And Poe uses the word sublime a lot, and he almost always uses it to describe the vastness of nature, the kind of limitless, imaginative possibilities of nature, right? Mm-hmm. Something completely counter to clock time, which is mechanistic, right? So she gazes out through this keyhole, and she sees the sublime vision of nature. And even in the story, she says, I won't bother you with the description of it. I'm not going to tell you what I saw. I'm just going to tell you then what happened to me after that, right? So, I mean, even in this, she's mechanistic in her approach. She can't even try to imagine the words necessary to describe the sublime. Instead, she's just going to describe the process of what happened, right? So again, there's this really clear association that Poe does. While she's standing there, she's literally standing on the shoulders of a slave, and she's contemplating, or she tells us she's contemplating the untold possibilities of this sublime vision. Until suddenly she feels cold steel upon her neck. Ooh. She turns her head slightly and realizes it's the minute hand of the giant clock that has ticked down to where her head is through at the keyhole. And when she tries to extricate herself from the keyhole, she finds she's stuck. And she now had to wait in horror, minute by minute, as the pressure on her neck increased until her eyes bulge and pop from her head, and then her neck is severed, or her head is severed from her body.
Sweet.
And rolls down the hill. She writes, she's still the author of the story, so she's writing from the afterlife, right?
Nice.
And I like how Poe writes, she was eventually decapitated, and he writes, quote, that she died, quote, at 25 minutes past 5 in the afternoon. Again, pointing out the specificity of this sort of mechanistic clock time, right? Oh, sorry, at 25 minutes past 5 in the afternoon, precisely. Zenobia was literally crushed by time, while imaginative possibilities were in front of her, but because she couldn't see past the mechanistic existence she was living, she couldn't go and pursue those imaginative, sublime possibilities. She was trapped
to so
by
many
time.
people. So many people.
Right.
Yep.
She was trapped by time. And, he's writing this in 1838, right? I mean, so we're talking about like right in the heart of when we're talking. Yes, many people are exactly like that. Poe is a remarkably poignant writer even today. Like if you go through and read him, it's amazing how much of his stuff holds up in terms of like the ideas that he's presenting.
They're almost trapped. They're trapped by life. Their life becomes
because
a
life
rut.
is spread out. Life is spread out in front of her, and she recognizes the beauty. She recognizes the sublimity, but she can't. She can't act on it because she's trapped by time. We're going to talk about another Poe story a little later, a story that gives this episode its title, but we'll get to that later. I just want to say descriptions like this by Poe, by Lewis Carroll, again, writing in 1865, these reflect the anxieties that a lot of people felt over the adoption of clock time, replacing kind of a natural idea of time. We're going to just sort of deal with this idea a lot in this episode. So with these anxieties in mind, let's look at clock time in the antebellum South. So mechanical clocks of some variety had existed for hundreds of years before the sort of 19th century. Excuse me, but they weren't especially accurate. They were prohibitively expensive until the Industrial Revolution.
And then the cuckoo clocks came.
Well, as you say, in the invention of the pendulum clock in the middle of the 17th century was the first innovation that made clocks really accurate. So, but
who was
of course,
the first to make the birdie come out? Who was the first to make the little birdie come out? Cuckoo,
I don't
cuckoo.
know. Dr. Cuckoo Kazoo. I don't know.
That's the trivia for the day. Come on now. You're the genius of this group.
I don't know. But okay. But yeah, I don't know. All I know is that pendulum clocks make things finally make things accurate. In the American colonies, and then the United States, mechanical, and then after around 1840, electric clock manufacturing centered in New England. So they were mechanical clocks, and then by 1840 they started making electric clocks. They were centered in New England, and especially Connecticut, as industrialization took hold. This becomes like a big boon for Connecticut in particular, but elsewhere in New England as well. Now, we talked about the process of de-skilling and the shift from workshop to factory production of goods way back in the beginning when we did our Robert Matthews episodes. We talked about him as a journeyman craftsman who kind of gets screwed by the Industrial Revolution. Mm-hmm. But those developments of sort of workshop to factory production and all that, they occurred primarily in the northern states and in the cities, to some degree, maybe in the South a little bit, but mostly this is a northern state phenomenon. They kind of developed hand in glove, these processes, developed hand in glove with industrial manufacturing. Developing hand in glove with industrial manufacturing was the desire by industrial and urban managers to use clock time to accurately track labor and output. Again, these are things we sort of accept as normal today, but like this is a process. The emergence of what we call like time discipline or clock regulated work were intimately forged with the emergence of capitalism. So understand that time discipline, again, it had to be created, had to be shaped by larger forces of commodification and rationalization. Commodification, of course, being the process of increasingly transforming raw materials and services into goods for market. Things that weren't raw materials before become raw materials now.
Correct.
That sort of thing. Things that used to just be part of the commons were now becoming commodified, right?
Yep.
And with the consequence, transitioning them from those items from their specific use value into a kind of market value. So again, an item used to be valued for what the value was based on what it was used for, its specific use. And now there's just a general market value for these commodities. Rationalization is the process of increasing efficiency in production by reducing cost. Usually this means cutting labor, right? So, killing jobs, as you might say.
The automation, saving time, killing jobs.
Yeah. So, for example, under feudalism, serfs or peasants, depending on where we're talking about, had guaranteed housing. They had protection provided by the manorial lords, and they also had lands for agriculture or artisanship. So, they didn't have very much social mobility. Children generally did the same work as their parents. Occasionally, a child might be sent off to apprentice in one of the guilds or something like that. But because there happened to be a growing need for one industry or another, or one craft or another. But generally speaking, you just did what your parents did, and that's where we get names like Thatcher, because she comes from a line of people who used to do thatched roofs, or Smith, because they were probably blacksmiths, maybe usually goldsmith. Names like Goldsmith or Silver all come from former silversmiths and goldsmiths and things like that. You get names like Chandler,
or Moorhead,
yeah.
Moorhead.
My favorite was a figure.
First name Craven.
Yeah. I encountered a guy one time named Richard Clapsaddle, and I thought, I'm not really sure where that family name comes from, like Dick Clapsaddle. I don't quite know, in the 16th century how you, since names are, things like Johnson means like you're like Tim Johnson because like you're Tim Johnson, or like John Jameson. Well, because you're John James' son.
James' son.
Yeah. And, but yeah, so that's where a lot of the surnames all come from that kind of stuff. Cooper means, you're from a long line of barrel makers, Taylor, because you come from a long line of tailors, right? Weaver. I mean, all these names are pretty understandable.
Yep.
Anyway, yes, exactly. But anyway, so there's little social mobility, right? But work was, for all intents and purposes, work was guaranteed. You were guaranteed a job. And the way that feudalism worked was that some percentage of the produce of the land was paid in rent to the landlords, right? These manorial lords, literal lords of the land. And then what you made yourself, like the surpluses that you made, were exchanged at kind of highly regulated markets. The markets were regulated by the guilds. So, the guild system, generally speaking, worked to, by and large, make sure that necessities were affordable. Small luxuries were affordable. They tended to keep things. While people wanted to make profit in order to exchange, there was no thought of accumulating wealth among regular folks. That didn't really exist yet. Not for most people. That sort of comes later. But anyway, the whole system was essentially held together by like mutual obligations and relationships. But I want to point out, for laborers, the work was dictated not by any sort of mechanical time that didn't exist through most of this time, but dictated by natural rhythms, right? The natural cycles of solar time, the natural cycle of seasonal time, these natural rhythms of rain and drought and all of that stuff. and by personal choices. Like there wasn't necessarily anybody there making you work. You worked when you wanted to work. You were paid by task. If you were a craftsman, you didn't get paid. Like if you went into blacksmith for 10 hours, you didn't get paid for 10 hours work. You got paid for however many horses you shod. You got paid for like each task came with its own whatever wage, right?
Mm-hmm.
I thought you were frozen. You haven't moved. Okay. Now, I want you to hear this and understand this.
Okay.
The average European peasant worked about 50 days a year to meet their
How many
rent
50-something days
obligations.
a year?
50, about 50 days a year
Okay.
in order to meet their rent obligations.
Okay.
So the rest of the year they had to work for themselves in whatever way they wanted to.
Okay.
The estimate is generally the peasants worked the equivalent of about 150 days total. So 50 for the Lord and 100 days for themselves, and they had the rest of the year for for festivals and just doing whatever they felt like doing.
Mm-hmm.
It should also be noted, the 100 days a year that they're working for themselves, they're working for themselves, right? They're working for their own profit and advantage. I've seen people say, "Oh, it was backbreaking labor and everything else." Sure, but there is a difference when you're doing backbreaking labor so that someone else gets the full measure of that, the value of that labor, and you're just getting a percentage as a wage, versus you're doing backbreaking labor, but it's for your family's benefit. You get to keep all of it. You do it all.
Sure.
You know what I mean? It's for you. So yeah, sure, it's still work, obviously, but there is a difference between sweeping your own floor and sweeping someone else's.
It's the entrepreneur versus the worker.
Except those words don't mean anything to to the feudal serf. But
they didn't mean anything then. They didn't realize it, but they were entrepreneurs in a way. I mean, they have their own business, right? They work for themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't call it that. They didn't really have a business. They just they had what they needed. Now, barring war or natural disaster, peasants ate fairly well from a caloric standpoint, right? They ate pretty nutrient-rich, if obviously bland diets. Now, they're bland for a couple of reasons. Number one, Europe doesn't really have access to any spices. So, that's one thing. They also, this is before anybody figured out that you could have ovens. So pretty much all you really ate were things like soups and stews, so that you could keep a fire burning and keep a pot cooking over the fire, and you'd make a stew with whatever stuff, and you just sort of add to it over the next few days, and just keep, they called it pottage.
Like
but
you
just sort of
the crock pot. They did a crock pot.
Yeah, they had a crock pot going for 6 days at a time before you sort of dump it and start fresh. You wouldn't dump it because you'd eat everything. And then you had real dense, real dense breads, like whole grain, real bread, So you had they had a pretty nutrient dense diet, or a nutrient rich diet. They got a fair amount of calories if they were bland, but they didn't know they were bland because they had never tried anything else. It's one of the great things is European, Western and Northern Europeans, people's minds were blown when they got their first black pepper coming back from the Crusades, and they were just like, "Oh my God, this is amazing! This is it's like a spicy little burst in your mouth." And you're like, you think today, salt and pepper on every table, everywhere you go, it's the most mundane of the seasonings, and yet, if you can imagine never having access to black pepper, the first time you would taste it would just be like, holy cow! It's so much out of such a small thing. There's so much, explosion of flavor, when all you had ever eaten your whole life were roots and potatoes and maybe a little bit of meat boiled in a pot. So all of a sudden to have pepper, I was like, oh, mind blowing. Anyway, like I said, guilds tightly controlled the markets, but beers, wines, and meads were all plentiful. Pretty much drank beer, wine, and mead all day.
Love it.
And because they were necessary, because water would kill you. So you drank, a fair amount of those things. And then certain necessary resources like land were not commodities. They were not commodified. So, there were the commons that were shared lands, and then you had the lands of the Lord that you had to farm, as part of your rent agreement. So time discipline, such as it was kind of marked by the ringing of church bells to call the monks to prayer and to celebrate the many, 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 many public holidays. So for laborers, time was generally their own, or more accurately, it was God's time, but by which I mean they were able to kind of do what they wanted. If you didn't do enough work, you would starve, but you're working for yourself most of the time. again, I don't want to like put put too shiny a glossy coat on feudalism. I mean, it was also a time where if you cut yourself on a piece of metal, you'd probably died.
Sure.
Pretty awful death.
I mean,
But like,
listen, that doesn't sound terrible what you just described, but I would imagine living back then sucked. Just
sure,
my
but it would have.
natural
But it's one
opinion.
of those things. It would have sucked no matter how you no matter how you look at it. It's
Sure.
it's like so. Okay, sorry to digress real quick. Like there we have this imagination where it's like, oh well, but if you were a king or a lord, things would be great. No, like kings and lords because eating meat was such a status symbol, and like so like the peasants would eat like mostly you'd have a diet that was mostly vegetables and cereal grains, and
Hmm.
they'd have a little bit of meat, some pork or some chicken, occasionally some beef, but pretty, very small amounts of meat during the course of their diet. Red meat, especially rare. Whereas, the lords and the ladies and and the kings and all, they eat like all meat and bread. That's all they eat. So just all of the annals of history are just like littered with just a constant who's who of European of rich, powerful Europeans. Well, rich is the wrong word. Powerful Europeans who like are just plagued constantly with hemorrhoids, with gout. They just none of them take a good shit like their entire life because all they eat is meat all the time, and like they're just miserable. They're all blocked up all the time. Like just constantly, it's either diarrhea or it's you can't go and you have hemorrhoids. Martin Luther sort of famously, like in all of his writings, he basically describes everything in terms of his anus. Like I mean, he just like
Ugh.
tells he just tells priests all the time that he's like just shitting on their work. When he's dying at the end of his life, he refers to himself as a stool that is waiting to pass through the anus of death, pass through the anus to death. I mean, like they're obsessed with this stuff because none of them. And Martin Luther like was one of these guys. He's rich, for the time. He came from a wealthy family and had access to nothing but meat. And so like these guys, they were miserable. They're just miserable all the time. I mean, if you can imagine just like living your whole life never being able to take a good dump, how absolutely miserable you'd be by say 25.
I
Um,
mean, they probably also their fucking mouth was probably killing them. Their teeth probably was
oh,
rotting out. And
sure. No,
they
there's
probably all dropped dead
any
of a heart
number of
attack by
reasons.
40.
Yeah, any number of reasons why life was miserable. But that's the one. That's the one thing I think about because it's the thing you do. You do like every
You
day,
take
or
you take for
you know,
granted the comfort that we have. We're
yeah,
here
yeah,
in
yeah.
our boudeilles, and they're like, they don't have. I don't know what
They
they had. A hole in the in like some wooden thing that's
Yeah, if you ever see those like old medieval castle buildings that have like the on the corner they
yes,
have
I
like the
know
round thing
exactly.
yeah,
Yes, I've
that's the
seen the
yeah,
diagram where they show how it's done, and
yeah,
it's just a hole, and you sit on like a stone with a hole in it.
yep,
Oof,
and you just drops on
not
down.
not comfortable.
Yeah, there's a great story from history where a bunch of rich dukes, German dukes, all get together to like during the wars of religion, and they all get together to plot their what they're going to do, and the floor collapses, and underneath the floor is all just raw sewage that's been just like collecting over just who
Ugh.
knows, and they sink in and they all drown and die
Ew,
in raw sewage. So they all die. It's just
got to do
like
that story.
just horrific stuff. Yeah, yeah. So anyway, anyway. So my point is, I don't want to make this sound like too wonderful or anything because it wasn't that, but like it was miserable for everybody. Even like the rich and powerful were miserable. Okay, but as far as time is concerned, laborers' time was generally their own, or more accurately, it belonged to the church. But still, like in their day to day life, they had a lot of control over what they did. Um, okay, the Protestant Reformation, in many ways, ushered in the beginning ideas of time discipline by promoting the idea that all time was God's time. Now, the social relationship with the church had always been like, hey, look, you jump through these hoops, you pay for your indulgences, and you tithe your 10%, and basically you're going to get into heaven. That's kind of how this deal works. We're going to mediate for you between you and God, And like you gotta come to the festivals and everything else, but don't worry, there's gonna be lots of wine and beer and mead and there's gonna be a big feast. And you've got to come to these different things. You gotta check all the boxes. But if you check all the boxes, good for you, you get to heaven. And with Luther basically breaking this down and saying, well, no, like none of this is in the Bible. And then, the sort of German princes who are like, wait, so we could have a cheaper religion? We're in. Um, they basically it so changes this dynamic. Like now, because Luther is like writing his own translation of the Bible in vernacular German, and so now there's no mediator. The mediator's gone, right? You don't need the church. You can read the Bible yourself, and so the time doesn't belong to the liturgical church calendar so much as time now is more directly God's time, right? So it becomes really important not to waste your time with things that you shouldn't be doing. You have to be productive with your time, right? This is kind of an essential component. We call it like the Puritan work ethic, but that's where it sort of comes from. It's the natural development of these ideas of like, well, if all time is, we are only here by the whim of God, and all of our time is God's own. We're supposed to be spending all of our time, all of our existence is supposed to be for the glory of Him. God, all of our time is God's time. And so then that sort of grows over time into this idea that like, well, you can't waste time. You have to be time thrifty. You know what I mean? You have to be productive all the time. You have to give an account for every moment later. So, okay. So just, again, I'm laying the groundwork for where this goes. So this is really an essential idea because of the early change in this conception of time that was brought about by the Reformation. This sort of in turn gives rise to mercantilism, which, as I know you know, but the economic policy that sort of favors the use of state power to push for greater exports, fewer imports, and the accumulation of precious metal money into state coffers. There's this kind of idea that like whoever has the most gold wins. So you just accumulate. Like that's the goal, is to accumulate as much as possible. And you do that by like protectionist tariffs and colonialization. That's where the colonies really come in. Is like, well, we need to bring resources in from outside so that we're not paying for resources, right? We could extract them from our own colonies and so on. So mercantilism stressed that while some time was God's time was also money. Thus, it needs to be saved and not wasted for reasons that were both sacred and secular, right? Again, it's like another little shift in the way people think about time. The mercantilism that encouraged colonialism and imperialism was baked into America's founding, right? Coupling these ideas with industrialization led to an increasing use of urban and factory clocks to regulate and coordinate personal, social, and economic activity, right? So clocks start to be used in the North, in particular with the industrial North, to regulate not just your economic activity, like your work, your labor, or whatever, but also your personal life, your social life. As the availability and affordability of clocks improve, their adoption spread beyond urban centers. Steamboats, telegraphs, and railroads would spread this new time discipline far beyond the borders of the cities and the ports. And in the process, they disseminated these ideas about wage labor time and that clock time should be obeyed and that punctuality was a civic and personal virtue. These are all sort of new ideas that get spread by, these new transportation technologies as people, right, take them out. These ideas enhance the legitimacy of the idea of free wage labor, and they usher in a world that becomes governed by the clock, right? In the industrial North, the appeal of the system makes some sense. It is, or at least seems to be, consistent with the burgeoning ideas of liberal democracy. And, like if you can sell your labor, that sort of seems consistent with democratic ideas. And it's especially useful to industrial bosses and sort of bourgeois managers, because then they can regulate labor through the clock. The appeal is also pretty clear in like the mine and timber-driven West, right, which is expanding in this early period. But the real question that we're going to kind of try and look at is where might clock discipline fit in the antebellum South, right, which is essentially an oligarchic economic structure, right? The South is an oligarchy.
Okay.
Southern planners were, of course, no less profit motivated than their Yankee neighbors, but they were no less inclined to understand the production of commodities. But when they looked to the north, they were afraid of what they saw as a mobocratic tendency or an anarchy tendency in the system of free wage labor when it was coupled with liberal democracy, right? They were worried about the idea of mob rule, as you might imagine Southern planters would be. Are you with me?
I'm with you. Okay.
I want you to just listen to that sentence again and think about think about what I'm saying here. Southern planters, they were afraid of the idea of a kind of liberal democracy. They were afraid of the idea of mob rule in the South.
Okay.
Because they're Southern planters. So they are especially afraid of the idea of majority rule.
Sure.
Because they would be immediately gibbeted.
Well,
because
they don't.
It's a handful of planters and then huge numbers of enslaved people, but also just like poor whites and everybody else. So they are very much afraid of the idea of liberal democracy in the South.
They're afraid of losing the free labor aspect of it, because that's what would cause the uprising, because it's slavery. But I think what they're also afraid of, and probably what would hold them at bay, is providing a wage, right, for that work.
No, they absolutely see that as the most terrifying idea.
Oh, I'm sure they do.
Imaginable.
I'm sure they do.
But it's also not just the. But keep in mind, like every white person in the South is not a planter. Like there are lots of poor whites. There are lots of sort of yeomen.
Sure.
And planters are an oligarchy. They are a small, thin veneer at the top of society who control all of society.
Well, it's no different than today, right? The top 1% of today, and you would think they would be probably dragged into the street and ripped apart as well if it wasn't for all the wages. Like there's a lot of rich people that become rich, and a lot of otherwise would be poor people that now can pay bills and make ends meet because of, say, a company that they're working for. Otherwise, it wasn't for that. I think these billionaires obviously would be, they'd be hunted down probably themselves today.
Winner, winner, chicken dinner.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, but anyway, I want you to understand that, like, for the planter class, there is nothing more terrifying than this combination of the free wage labor coupled with liberal democracy. Like they see that as mobocratic and they see it as anarchy.
Yes.
Okay.
And cutting into all their profit.
Yeah, it's not even. It's more than just that. It's much more than just that.
Sure.
For Southern planters, slavery was as much about social control as it was about profit.
Mm-hmm.
The system preserved the hierarchic social order that put them at the top of society. So, in many ways, their power was as, if not more important than their profit. It was certainly as important. The system preserved. So their role at the top of the social hierarchy was, to them, the only way that you could actually be truly independent. So they saw slavery as necessary for their own independence. It's one of the main contradictions of the system. Okay, as there's the German philosopher George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel explained in his sort of famous master-slave dialectic, quote, "The master is in possession of an overabundance of physical necessities generally, the slave in the lack thereof. The master's situation is independent, and his essential nature is to be for himself," end quote. By contrast, the slave is characterized by the lack of recognition, is viewed as a thing. Quote, "Thinghood is the essence of slave consciousness," end quote. But here's the thing. Hegel pointed out the master is only independent so long as the slave remains in this state of slave consciousness. In other words, Hegel believed that as soon as the slave stopped seeing himself as a slave, he would, at that moment, cease to be a slave. But he's very specific about what that means. Because, like, in reality, as Hegel pointed out, the master is actually the one who is dependent. The master is completely dependent on the slave for the very overabundance that makes the master independent, right? So if slave consciousness, if this belief that slaves have that they are slaves, as Hegel sees it, the contradiction of the situation would be laid bare, and the masters would immediately lose their independence, right? Because the only thing that makes them independent, they're not independent. They're completely dependent on slaves. So the only thing that makes them independent is this sort of delusion of enslavement that enslaved people have. Does that make sense?
It's like controlling people with fear. And if people
Mhm.
stop fearing you, then you lose control of them. So,
Sure. Yes.
that's kind of the same concept.
It's the same thing today with like when you look at like the railroad strike that didn't happen.
Mhm.
And it's like the railroad workers have all the power.
Mm-hmm.
They are the, or they, if they believe themselves to, they do.
Sure.
Because they're the ones providing the necessary labor. The railroad
Yes.
bosses are worthless without them. If
Correct.
they were all gone, there would be no industry.
I think that speaks to every business.
Exactly.
Yes.
Right. It's the people at the bottom that have all the power, but they are held in check by a variety of social forces.
Correct.
Like held in check, meaning they are prevented from achieving their own actual independence.
Correct.
Right. Which, but I think I say it later, but Hegel basically sort of points out that like the only way that you actually achieve independence is at the moment that you are like, you have an actual willingness to die. Because if you're willing to die, like at the moment you're actually literally willing to die, is the moment that you prove that you're not a slave, right? Because somebody else doesn't own your life. You own your life and you're willing to lose it to prove your independence, right? So that's the only way to sort of get out of this relationship. And it's the same thing with like a strike. If you go on strike, you know that the police are going to be called out. They're going to crack your skulls. The police might shoot at you. The National Guard might be called out to shoot at you. This is the history of labor history. And so you know that you could die if you go on strike.
Well, I think
because
you
while you have the power as the labor, they have the power with the money and the backing of state violence.
Yes, I mean, listen, that what you're stating is true. It's historically accurate with the labor movement, but in modern times, like when I say modern times, I mean like in 2022, there's no real violence anymore, and like most of these companies like Verizon went on strike. You see them, they picket. You go downtown, you see like some business will be on strike, and there'll be people picketing. And the violence now is more of a financial violence. It's more of a social violence where the decision isn't, do I go on strike and face police brutality and the other side of the line beating me with clubs? Now it's, do I go on strike and face the possibility of losing my job or not being able to pay my bills because I'm not making money while I'm on the picket line? And that's
right.
more
But
of
again,
today's.
If you tease that out farther,
mm-hmm.
those notions of independence continue. Like those notions of dependence, rather.
Sure, it's the same.
If you keep teasing,
I get it. Yep.
It's not. You're not just dependent on your employer. You're also dependent on your bank, who has the mortgage on your house. Yep. You're dependent on the bank that has the mortgage or has the lien on your car, and you're dependent on this economic system in order to get food because the system is such that it's layer upon layer upon layer of dependence.
And if we keep peeling that onion, that's why I also fight for and like to fight for the small business owner, because that is an employee breaking free for independence, creating his own business from typically a skill they acquired or whatever from a larger company. They didn't want to be in the rat race anymore, so they broke away. They decided to start their own business. And that's what is so wonderful about the country we live in, that they have the ability to do that. That's why I'm a proponent of, tax breaks for small business owners, doing everything we can to help them to create those, opportunities. And then hopefully it entices other people to do the same thing. And that's kind of the battle for time. People start their own business so that way they have their own time that they can spend with family and do, things that they want to do instead of working a 9 to 5. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to get there. But hey, look, our country's built off of the entrepreneur. It's built off of the small business owner. What we have to really be afraid of is the big Amazons of the world, the Walmarts of the world that gobble up all the small business owners now. And that's the scariest trend, that and the AI and the independent,
Yeah, I can't get into this too much, but I would also the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie is equally scary, but that's neither here nor there. But that's we have both competing factions. My point about all this is just that. I mean, I hear what you're saying. And I'm not going to argue with you about this, but yeah, the point is exactly that yeah, there is there is something about there's something built into independence, into this idea of like once you acknowledge, like you have to again, just dealing with this master slave situation, you have to be willing to die and deprive the person who claims your life by declaring that it's your life to give up, right? Like that's kind of, it has to be that dramatic, as it were, in order to prove. Okay. So anyway, okay, so this is, as Hegel is concerned, as far as Hegel's concerned, the only way that you can really demonstrate your humanity is to prove that you own your humanness, and the only way to do that, of course, is to risk literal death, because anything short of that threatens to return you to thingness, right? So, as most humans do, the vast majority choose life over true freedom. They choose, they choose the convenience of continuing to live rather than the very risky proposition that you might die.
Correct.
Right. It's one of the things where people are like, God, with slaves outnumbered planters significantly all the time, like in all kinds of places and all that, why weren't there more rebellions? Well, because if you rise up, some people will die. And that is a hard thing to do. Like, look at how far, I mean, Americans are pushed. I mean, regular people, working class people have been crushed in this country for years, decades, and just continue to not rise up. Part of that is because there's a culture, but because you look at France, they're talking about reducing the retirement age by 2 years, and they've got 1 million people in the streets, with Molotov cocktails at the ready. And they're like, hell no, we will retire at 64. Yeah. Screw you. And because they have a more radical tradition baked in. But it's like in this country, they could literally just be like, you can start getting Social Security when you're 85, and everybody be like, well, I guess there's nothing we can do. I mean, it's just, we are, we should be embarrassed when we look around the world at how people fight for stuff. And there are people here that do, but most of us are just like, well, I'd rather live. Anyway, here's the thing. Southern planters recognize their precarious position, right? They understood that their independence was that their independence was actually kind of dependence on these bondspeople. So because of that, of course, Southern planters could never actually be agents of progress, because by being an agent of progress, they would annihilate their own position, right? So they could not, I mean, you would have to be willing to annihilate your own position in order to do that.
Sure.
And again, there have been people that have done this in the past, but generally speaking, that's even harder to do. So, okay. That said, Southern planters still wanted to be seen as modern, and they were increasingly engaged in this sort of expanding capitalist world of the early 19th century. Historians Eric Williams and C.L.R. James have both convincingly argued that plantation slavery was quintessentially a modern institution of capitalist exploitation, just as the historian Marcus Rediker has shown that the slave ship operated as a kind of capitalist factory, transforming the raw material of humanity into an enslaved commodity across the, in the transatlantic passage, right? You pick up raw materials, and the process of the horrific transatlantic middle passage, because it was so horrible, so cruel, so violent, so everything else, by the time you arrived on the other side, the process of turning those raw material human beings into the commodity of slaves had taken root for many people, right? Does that make sense?
Yes.
I'd like to do a podcast on his book called The Slave Ship someday.
That would be interesting. Very interesting.
It's a very cool book. It's a really very creative read on slave ships. Very interesting.
Did any of them break off and become black pirates?
It does happen. I've got a cool book called that I read called Blackjacks about African Americans in the Age of Sail who became pirates, or they became sailors, or they became private, work for privateers or whatever else. Many of them being former slaves, not all of them, but most of them were former slaves. It's a pretty cool. That's another pretty cool book. Anyway,
that would be an amazing story.
Yeah. That's it. I want to do a story about that stuff one of these days. Excuse me. Anyway, regardless of that, the antebellum South was more like a mercantilist capitalist vision. So again, that idea of extracting raw materials and then turning them to commodities and accumulating wealth internally, right? Trying to keep exports high and imports low, but they sort of fail at that. But that's their vision. And this is a vision that would seem less likely to require or even desire clock time, because again, the agricultural nature of it. But yet, throughout the 19th century, we see that the number of clocks and watches in the South increased greatly, right? So, furthermore, we have significant evidence that planters tried to instill clock discipline into their enslaved populations and in their own lives. So remember, by 1860, Southerners were willing to reject liberal democracy and its kind of spouse, free wage labor, and they were willing to reject this with a kind of suicidal passion that was the Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting to look at how and why they went about implementing one of the most potent tools that had been used to implement the very systems that they would then suicidally reject, right? So why would they use those tools, and how do they go about doing it? Because obviously they can't use clock labor in the same way they do in the North, because that is dependent on free wage labor, and it's dependent on liberal democracy to function, right? So anyway, okay. So the benign liberal view of classical economists like Adam Smith is that workers were not naturally lazy, and if they behaved as if they were lazy, it was because of insufficient motivation to do otherwise. People like Adam Smith, called the father of capitalism, he equated wage with time, and believed that you could induce labor or workers to labor out of the kind of spirit of acquisition, right? If you offer them enough, they'll work harder, right? Mm-hmm. In other words, it wasn't the people don't want to work anymore. It was people are unwilling to work if you aren't motivating them with higher wages, right? That's the Adam Smith kind of philosophy.
That was actually correct up until just recently, actually, that philosophy worked until absolutely just recently, and then it kind of flip-flopped because of the new labor issues going on. Very interesting.
I think if you still offered enough money, people would do whatever, but
a lot of nowadays, it's wages used to be number one. Now it's culture is number one. So I don't think so. A lot of individuals, especially in the trades, who are offering, $1 more than their competitors and still unable to fill positions, are always wondering why. And a lot of analytic companies have gone in and started really asking the question, why would someone work for you? And then owners and business leaders started asking that question and started revamping everything from the recruiting process to the onboarding process to not only is it salary based, but now employees want to have more input in decision making, and they want to be a part of the actual business, meaning they want to make a difference. They want to make a difference.
They want more democracy.
Yes.
They want more democracy in the workplace.
But pay, actually, they want fair pay. But pay has dropped down the scale from number one to maybe number 4 these days, believe it or not. Now, not saying people don't want to work for money and not saying they're going to give you a break, but they just want fair pay, not where it used to be, I want more than this guy. I want to make you offer me $1 more, I'm there, right? That was the attitude, money talks and BS walks type of shit.
Sure.
Now it's, I want to be cuddled. I want my safe space. I want my time off. I want, I want to bring my dog to work. I want to,
I want a better work-life balance.
Absolutely. The work-life balance, quote unquote, is the signature call of that, I guess, generation that has come through and changed, where it used to be the employer had all the leverage. Now the employee has all the leverage. And
well, that's why we have an inflation, is because the reason we have an inflation is because they're trying to reassert control. The employers are. So they're trying to discipline labor. I mean, there are other reasons,
Well,
but the
I don't
reason
think they're pushing back as much
well, I mean, I
as
don't know
much as they are trying
when
to evolve.
the central bank keeps announcing, well, I guess we're going to have to keep raising interest rates until more people get fired. It's very clear that they're trying to discipline labor. They're not saying, well, we're going to have to we're going to have to tighten the belt on what businesses are able to do until they bring wages up. We're going to have to bring until they bring inflation down. They're not doing that. They're saying we're going to punish labor, and once labor gets punished enough, then if labor gets punished enough, then they'll be desperate enough to work for nothing, and that will bring inflation down. I mean, that's the goal: is to drive wage. I mean, they've said. I mean, Jerome Powell has flat out said we're going to raise interest rates because unemployment isn't high enough, and because wages are still too high. So we need to bring wages down, and we need to bring unemployment up, and that is the goal of the central bank. And the central bank is the financial institution that is dominated by business interests. They are operating on behalf of big business. I mean, that is the bottom line. So that is, regardless of all this other stuff, 100% the reason that we continue to have this inflation and it keeps getting worse, and the reason that the reason we continue to have the inflation and all this and this labor problem, or whatever, if you want to call it a labor problem, it's you could just as easily call it an employer problem. But the reason for this, all of this, is that labor, they want to discipline labor. Labor got a little uppity, tried to flex its muscles and say, hey, no, we want to be treated better. We want more input in our life. We're tired of being ground to a pulp by the clock. And, I want to have a better life. I want my life to be more than just work. And because labor has done that, the entire system is trying to discipline them through a variety of mechanisms that they have at their disposal. And so, I mean, we've already seen that, like, when they investigated what the inflation is, they're like, oh, the inflation is like 60% higher than it needs to be because of profiteering. That we've seen that basically the free money that's been offered by the banks has been, rather than being reinvested into business in order to bring in more employees or bring in to make sure you have a reserve labor force in order to improve safety conditions, in order to improve working conditions, in order to improve healthcare benefits or whatever else. Instead of doing any of that stuff, they've taken all this free money and basically put it into stock options in order to enrich the C-suite and the big investors. And and now, so for years, that's what business has done, is they've borrowed at no interest in order to enrich themselves. They've taken free money to enrich themselves and have not done the things that were necessary to improve the working conditions in any way, shape, or form, or wages. And then with the pandemic and everything else, sort of sets off, sort of lays bare a lot of these problems. And so labor starts demanding more. And this is the result of that. The result of labor demanding more is, we're going to punish you. We're going to punish you. We're going to discipline labor.
I don't think there's much correlation there. I think that might be what he said. That might be what the central bank said. But the difference here, what you're talking about, is probably the Dow 30, the top big, humongous companies. You're not talking about, so any company who has, let's say, less than 300 or 400 employees.
Yeah, but they don't have any power. I'm not talking about them. They have no power. I'm talking about the people with power.
They don't have power, but they make up the bulk of the country.
Doesn't matter. They don't have power.
Make up most businesses.
It doesn't matter. They don't have the power. They're not the ones who own our politics. They're not the ones who own the system.
But they're the ones that are hiring. That's the one who I'm talking about.
I don't care.
When these companies are looking for people, that's
completely,
the labor force.
That's completely irrelevant.
Is impacting them.
Yeah.
The labor force is impacting.
I understand.
The other companies that you're talking about are going to start layoffs, and you're right. It's going to hurt the
employees. They've already started.
They're laying off. You already see it.
Yeah.
Already started it. That's not going to happen with the mid to small companies. That can't happen because they have no choice.
It will trickle down to them. Because, of course,
I don't believe that'll happen.
Well, I mean, okay, so you tell me. You lay off a million middle class email jobs, right? Middle class salaried email type jobs. You lay off a million of them from these big companies. How many of those people then decide that they need to bring in a local contractor because they're going to remodel their kitchen now they've just been laid off from Microsoft or Twitter or Facebook, or they've been laid off by Amazon, as a mid-tier, manager. They've been laid off by Lowe's as a corporate manager. They've been laid off by these. Who's going to then go and who's going to say, you know what, I really need a massage therapist now? No, that's like the kind of thing you cut out. Who's going to say, oh, I need to remodel my kitchen? No, that's the stuff you cut out. You cut out all those.
You're correct.
So all of those mid-tier jobs that are hiring now, this will all the layoffs trickle down to them. It's the one way that trickle-down economics works. In that shit rolls down.
The layoffs won't trickle down to them, but a lot of the layoff people will get those jobs now. There'll be a lot of more workforce available for those individuals. See, the small to mid-sized companies they don't have the luxury to go through layoffs. They won't be a 2024.
But their market will shrink, because there will be fewer customers available.
Obviously, it depends.
That's what I'm saying.
It depends on the industry and if it's a need or a
yeah,
want.
If it's a need
There's
or a want.
Yes,
that's what I'm talking about. Wants. I'm saying,
sure.
You'll see it's like it's like even when the economy's bad, bars still do well. But the prices in bars have gone up so high that I'm not sure that they will.
Dude, you ain't kidding me, man.
You know what I mean? Like,
let me tell you a little story.
But liquor sales won't go down. They'll be fine.
I went on a date about a couple weeks ago with this broad. Went to lunch, what I call a narcos lunch. We had a great time. We went to lunch. We had a couple small plates. We were drinking some wine. Great conversation. That led all the way to like dinner. Ordered a couple more small plates, more drinks. Had a wonderful time. Well, it wasn't too extravagant. Small plates. We weren't ordering filet mignon, but
sure.
And we just had some drinks.
Yeah, tapas and drinks.
My bill was $250 for the two of us. Yeah. I also went out with another night for a group of us, maybe four of us. And again, having drinks, couple tapas plates. Again, same thing. Small plates, appetizers, maybe two or three of them.
Sure.
I was drinking drafts. We did a couple shots for someone's birthday, and that was it. $700 bill.
That's insane. It's insane.
It's absolutely crazy.
Yep.
I have not seen anything like it. I mean, and then to go to the liquor store and buy beer isn't much cheaper.
No, it's not
these days.
No, I mean, it's a 6-pack's $12, $13.
I mean, it's unreal. Yep. It's unbelievable.
Yep. I know. It's insane. All right. Anyway,
crazy.
Sorry. So look here. I promise this. I'm actually going to get into like a few minutes, but this is all kind of still the introduction to the introduction. So I hope it's okay. I hope this is going okay. Like I said, this is where I was a little.
No, this is good.
I was a little nervous about all this, but I feel like this is a lot of groundwork to cover, because it's talking about time is a weird topic to talk about.
They're very interesting. I'm very interested. I love the concept. I love the topic of time. Like I said, this is a very interesting topic, and I'm very interested in how the concept and back in the days that you're talking about, the individuals started to connect. I need this done at a quicker rate to make more money. I need this done quicker. I need this project done quicker. And then if I'm paying now, if we move ahead into the salary and not just the slave labor, but salary labor, then it really becomes an essential.
Yeah.
It's essential. It's like, I'm paying you by the hour, so we have to get this done this many hours, or I'm no longer profitable.
Right.
So it really evolves into being the number one commodity
for now.
Time
for the moment,
no question.
All right. So I want you to think about this. So Adam Smith's idea was this idea that like people are only unwilling to work if you aren't motivating them with higher wages, right? He doesn't believe that labor is necessarily just lazy and that workers are lazy and all that. He's like, if they're lazy, they're not really lazy. It's that they're not being paid enough, so they're not willing to work harder than they know they're
not motivated. Yes.
To Adam Smith, he's like, people know their value, so they're working to the value that they actually deserve. So if they believe you're paying them half what they're worth, they're going to work at half speed to at least make it worth their, or just fast enough to not get fired or whatever. Okay, so the thing about this is it gets kind of merged with the what is the implicit threat of starvation and death for workers if they don't work at whatever wage, right? Like that's the other part of this, is that capitalism requires a surplus population to serve as the kind of metaphorical stick to the carrot of wages. right? Like that's the way you discipline labor is like we have to have a homeless population to scare the hell out of people because if they don't work, they're afraid they'll be that. So we need that. That is part. It's built into the system.
No,
You have to have.
I don't agree with
Well,
that.
it's
I
built.
don't agree
Well,
with that.
it's the same way that the United States redefined full employment as 5% unemployment. Like we decided that
So
5% of people without a job is full employment because we need to have a surplus population. And I mean, and
so
again, big quotes on that.
I get what you're saying, but just thinking from my thought point of view, I need a job not because I'm necessarily scared of homelessness. I need a job because I have needs and wants, right? I think every human has their needs and wants, unless you know you have an I'm not talking about mental issues, I'm not talking about
Sure,
physical issues, but just if you're a normal not, I know you hate that word, if you're an average person, right, that's capable,
sure.
you're going to have, you need to pay your car insurance, you need to buy a car. I'm not talking about back then, I'm talking about
Yeah,
now.
I understand.
Back then, all right, maybe in a simpler time you still have them, but you got to take care of your family, there's a lot more family. So I don't necessarily think, I think the homelessness is an unfortunate side effect of the because when you have all that amount of people, you're gonna have
It
the
is.
slice
It is
that's
a.
just not
It
gonna
is a feature
make it,
of the
right?
American system, not a bug at this point. Um, because like, well, it doesn't matter. It's a feature, not a bug. It is the homelessness is a feature of a more modern turn, but a surplus population. It is important to maintain some percentage of the population that is unemployed because
This
because you
this
can use
concept, by the
them
way,
as a threat to the people who are employed when they ask for more wages to say no. There's five guys outside that want your job.
sure, that's true. In today's world, though, it's very interesting because the homelessness isn't necessarily,
Yeah,
again,
yeah,
scaring anyone,
because they're
and a
being
lot of people
shuffled
actually
off.
choose it.
Uh,
People choose this. Like if you look at the tent cities, these individuals have their own environment, their own kind of community now,
yeah,
and they're sprouting up everywhere. You've had like, an underground community of homeless people that they get by, and they figured out a way
sure.
to just live off of the
I
land.
think
You know what
most
I
of them
mean?
the overwhelming majority would rather have security. Um,
But here's my
I
question
mean, they'd
about
rather not
that.
be hassled by the cops. They'd not rather not
I,
like
I
they'd rather not have their possessions set on fire by the police, like has been happening in
do
L.A.
you think
Or
do you think they can get a job? Do you think they're incapable of it, or do you think they choose
oh
not
no
to?
no no, I think that what happens no I no I think that homelessness uh, went through the roof during Reagan's deregulation, and I mean when he stripped all the public services that we used to provide for people at the margins. When he stripped funding for all those things, that spiked it, and then it's only gotten
But I
worse
see that as
under
being with mental health. I agree with you,
not just mental
right?
health, but also lots of things. I mean, think about okay, think about how if you're living really close to the margins. I mean, you are just ends there's nothing left over. You're not doing you're everything at the end of the month.
Sure,
You're just barely getting
been
by
there.
in the cheapest
Yep,
in the cheapest place you could possibly live, public housing, and
sure.
you got a kid, and your kid gets sick, or you get sick, and you miss work for you have to miss work for a month because you have some debilitating thing. Well, you get fired or you lose your job because you live in a right to work state, so they can fire you for any reason, and so you lose your job, and all of a sudden now you're a month behind on your bills, and then you got to go
Hmm.
try and find a job, and you're still recovering from your illness, or your kid's still sick, and you're still having to do doctor's appointments. Think of how quickly and how easily that person ends up on the street
No question.
when you stripped away the social safety net to help people. You're like, oh well, we have decided we're only going to let you have welfare for we're only going to let you have welfare for 16 weeks or for 12 weeks or for 8 weeks, and only if you prove that you're applying to 5 jobs a week. And you're like, yeah, but I'm in the hospital, like I can't apply to 8 jobs, or yeah, but I'm dealing with this debilitating illness for my kid or my mother or my father, and how quickly you end up homeless. That happens all the time. And then go back to 2008 when this really spiked, when all these people lost their homes because they got
Hmm.
conned into into sign. I mean, like they got tricked.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, no. They got tricked. Like, we've seen that.
Don't tell me they didn't know exactly what was going
look
on.
Here, Mike.
Don't tell me they didn't.
No.
Look, someone tells me, hey, look, man, just sign this, man. I'll give you a mortgage. I'll be like, hold everything. I mean, look, if you don't understand that there's interest only, what could happen if you don't get that, it's not the fault of the individual selling the mortgage.
Well, what about when the internal documents at places like Wells Fargo said they were intentionally targeting people who could not afford them, and they were given direct instructions to push people into these even when they knew they couldn't afford them.
Sure.
And now hold on a second. Now hold on. You say this. Now I want you to say, okay. You go to the doctor because you got a weird lump on the back of your leg. You don't know what it is.
Different, but okay.
No, not just listen.
If it is,
and the doctor says, and you go to the doctor, and the doctor tells you what to do because the doctor is an expert. You've gone to the expert to explain to you something that you don't know what to do or how to deal with.
Sure.
So do you say, well, I don't know. I'm not sure if I'm going to trust the doctor. I'm going to see if I can't, figure out medical school on my own. Because that's what it is when you have you bought a house? I mean, do you know what it's like going through the mortgage documents and everything else? It's insane.
It's daunting.
It's daunting. It's insane. And we had a lawyer to go over it with us because, Mike, I'm a smart guy. I did not understand. I don't understand the language. It's written so that I can't understand it. It's intentionally designed to use language in ways that are not clear to any regular person. We had a lawyer so that we knew what we were going through. Now, if I had happened to have a lawyer that was under contract from Wells Fargo, and Wells Fargo was trying to push us into a mortgage we couldn't afford, they knew we couldn't afford because they didn't care. I am going to listen to the expert that I've gone to talk to.
I understand to get a lawyer to go through a contract like that, but you didn't need a lawyer to understand this is my monthly payment. This is what I make.
Sure.
Right? Very basic mathematics. Now, you also didn't go out.
Hold on. The people that bought those.
Hold on. Does this happen to
people that bought those houses, those mortgages were variable rate mortgages, and people were like, "This is what it is, and I can afford it now." And then the rates changed on them.
Correct.
And that is a technical thing that would be very easy not to understand. I
get that.
And
totally agree with you there.
But
totally
okay, look, we can't go into this. We can't go. We got to go.
Yes.
But
I get another rabbit hole.
You do agree that capitalism requires a surplus labor pool, right? You need to have the people at the gates that are willing to take the job in order to put pressure on the employee so that they don't agitate too much. They have to be afraid of losing the job.
You need people at the gates. No, you need people at the gates so that you can scale and produce more.
Well, no, but
that's why it's not a scare tactic.
No, it is not a scare. I'm not saying. Well, it is. I mean, and
it's as a business owner,
you should literally read
more
what people
people
like Henry Frick write. But okay, you should read what
industrialists
were writing.
That.
Well, no, this isn't just what it looks like. You should read what Rockefeller and Carnegie, Henry Frick, and Vanderbilt, what these guys wrote. That was they understood this and wrote about this. That it is really it is really
that
important.
Was a different time,
it is really important for them. They were it's important to make sure that there are. But this is the time I'm talking about.
Okay.
So you need to have a surplus. You need to have. It is the reason that the United States changed the idea of full labor to being 5% unemployment, because under our system, 5% of the population without jobs means everybody that needs it, that everybody has a job as far as they're concerned. And then you have a 5% labor pool from which to draw, which serves as, yes, I understand can help people scale up, but is also there to apply soft pressure to currently employed people so that they don't agitate. Not so they don't, but to try and put pressure so that they won't.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think it's as direct as all that. It's subtle.
Right. I also do believe that it's considered for employment because you do have individuals that are not going to be in the workforce, such as spouses that are stay-home parents and
Yeah, but they're not
people like
they're
that.
not unemployed.
Well, they are
No,
unemployed.
they're not calculated as part of unemployment. Unemployment, the unemployment rate are people who are actively looking for a job and don't have one. So the unemployment rate is always well below the number of people who are actually who would actually like to get a job, because a lot of people
There's a
drop
lot
out.
of people that stop.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then there's people that, like you say, that just don't want, are not looking for work. There's a broader discussion that we should have about the nature of work and concepts like that we accept as normal, like, oh, you have to earn a living, as if being a human being isn't worthy of just being alive. You actually have to earn a living, which is, again, doesn't seem like much, but that is a big deal. The fact that we think that, humanity is not sufficient to be deserving of, say, the dignity of life. You must also be productive.
No.
That is, producing all the time. You have to be a productive member of society. You can't just be, and again, like there is a way that we could conceive of a society where people have an impulse to do things.
Mm-hmm.
There is a way we can imagine a society where people do the things that they want to do, the things that they feel drawn to, and we value those things insofar as they are, in a barter system, and you can exchange those goods, and whatever they're doing. There is a way that you could construct a different kind of economy, but that is not. I'm not trying to get into some sort of utopian ism here. I'm just trying to get to the part where I actually talk about clocks. God damn it. Anyway, so look, all right. Look, workers could be motivated by time once wages and time become linked in their minds. Additionally, in northern factories with artificial lighting, and in the early stage, we're talking about like, whale oil, and things like that. But because of artificial lighting in factories, something that works in factories that doesn't work, say, in a cotton field or in a rice, in rice paddies, but artificial lighting makes labor not depend on natural time, right? So again, the clock sort of makes sense in a way. They could administer clock time in a different way in northern factories. Planners, however, maintained a mercantilist view of time because they retained some of the older obligation model, twisted though it was. They viewed the laboring classes as lazy and indolent, and because wages were irrelevant, if not just completely antithetical to their system, the clock would have to be adopted as a kind of complementary tool of discipline, something that could work alongside the whip, as opposed to being the motivator, right? It's the only way it works within that structure. So, of course, real world experiences don't line up perfectly with like the theoretical formulas of, Adam Smith or Karl Marx or Hegel or whatever. And industrial capitalists often harbored great distrust of their workers in North and South alike. And some degree of coercion was deployed to force workers to labor. In other words, whether they're relying on actual slaves or wage slaves, the owners of capital harbored a kind of distrust for workers. We can't really understand laborers as a class unless we recognize that, unless we recognize the social and cultural formations that grew from processes of change or accommodation over time. So we have a tendency to only view the kind of victorious outcomes of social change as the ones that are worth understanding. But I'd say that's foolish, and it's pretty short-sighted. As the historian E.P. Thompson wrote in his really amazing book about how the laboring class of how the working class of England came into existence, and like as a class. It's an amazing book if you ever feel like reading 900 pages of of labor history. It's pretty impressive. Anyway, he wrote, quote, "This tends to obscure the agency of working people, the degree to which they contributed by conscious efforts to the making of history," end quote. So for Thompson, he says, by focusing exclusively on the winning ideas and forgetting, quote, "the blind alleys, the lost causes, and the losers themselves," end quote, we fail to recognize the validity of their own aspirations on their own terms and the validity of their own experiences. So this is, again, something to keep in mind. We're not just going to look at the people who won. We're also going to look at people who lost and what they were fighting for, even though they lost, because that tells us something about how they viewed the world in which they lived. Okay, that's the point. So because time wage negotiations in the North brought a kind of watch owning, clock listening working class into the kind of ideological folds of industrial capitalism and the logic of that system, and it did it by teaching the language and the worth of clock time, right? So people had to learn this, that like to think about time as money, the value of clock time. This promoted the kind of individualistic liberal democracy of our early burgeoning nation in the 19th century. In the South, however, a slave's time belonged to the master. There could be no negotiation over the value of time or the worth of time. Southern planters wanted capitalism without democracy. They believed that watch and clock owning slaves could easily become time negotiating workers. And so they sought to impose clock time as a matter of obedience, but stripped of any of the negotiations over time that come with it, right? Planters wanted to impose the kind of factory-like clock punching time discipline, but they had to do it within the confines of this system that was dependent on seasonal patterns and like, you know, the what's called the diurnal pattern, that is the sun up, sundown pattern of every day. In other words, they wanted clock punchers in a system that had no clocks to punch. And if this isn't clear so far, the reason this was so important was that the clock bestowed power on the people who knew how to use them, sort of like language, right? Like, or literacy. Like if you know how to use literacy, it's a very powerful weapon for imperialism, right? So like every other property class, planters coveted profit and they coveted social control of labor. And so any additional tools of power that would help them control labor and improve profit were going to be welcome. They just had to figure out how to use it. So the key thing to consider here is that because of the reliance on agriculture and slavery, it's been easy for people to dismiss the antebellum South as a kind of relic of a bygone era. I think this is kind of the stereotype most people have of the pre-Civil War South in particular. Even today, a lot of this sticks around, that the South was stuck in a kind of pre-modern mode of thinking and pre-modern behavior, unlike the progressive, rapidly modernizing North. But if we look at the question of time, we can see how Southern planters were modernizing, that they were somewhat unique among agricultural societies and that they were internalizing the clock discipline and trying to apply the same to their plantation system, just doing it in a different way that's maybe a little harder to recognize than the traditional way of northern factories. Scholars are kind of near universal in the belief that the modern compulsion to obey time was set in motion by the availability of mechanical timepieces. So keep in mind, we're talking about a whole new way of thinking that changes because of the shift from pristine solar time to an increasingly kind of measurable, fragmented mechanical time. Fragmented, meaning, you know, divided by the minute, by the second, by the hour, whatever. Again, because labor in the South was largely dependent on natural solar time, it seems kind of hard to imagine that modern clock-dependent personalities would develop there. But this kind of ignores the how many clocks and watches existed in the South, right? Like, you know, people became clock dependent, and we can tell because of how many clocks there were and how many watches there were. And it kind of ignores the conflicts between like task-oriented labor and time-disciplined labor that emerged there, right? So again, agricultural labor tends to be more task-oriented than time-oriented, right? We can see that. Day laborers and things are not uncommon to us. Okay.
Hey, Unbalanced listeners. It's Brian here. Listen, I'm going to end this first part here as a kind of long introduction. I left a lot of our digression and discussion intact. A lot of times I would just pull that out to keep the story in line. But in this case, I thought it was all pretty interesting, so I left it in. Part two will be kind of the actual story, that beginning of the real story that we're telling here. So stay tuned for that. That should be up and running very soon. In the meantime, enjoy this very extended introduction and discussion, and thanks for listening.